Michael Calabrese, director of the Wireless Future Program here at New America. And this is the power of organizing without organizations. And actually a new book to provide an excuse to convene around this topic, although, we would love to in any case, because this is definitely very provocative, very timely. Clay Shirky writes, teaches, and consults on the social and economic impact of the Internet's evolution, and particularly the revolution that it is steadily causing in society. He's on the faculty of NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program and publishes widely in leading outlets, and also consults for a wide range of leading companies, the BBC, the U.S. Navy, and others. Clay is he's just a kind of a font of provocative insights and ideas. In fact, where we first kind of ran into each other some years ago when New America began advocating for opening up all the underutilized and unused white space on the airwaves. So things like, for example, one of our leading proposals is to open all the vacant TV channels for shared unlicensed use. And Clay had, this was at the time of when Napster was very controversial. People, because the music industry had everything frozen up, and so people said, well, hell, we got the technology to share, let's share. And so Clay said, why don't we look at what the FCC is doing through that same lens? They have this command and control system that's keeping the public from using the public airwaves. And so we convened an event where Clay talked about FCC stir, how if the FCC didn't get with the program, that hackers were going to start just retuning these smart radio devices and using these airwaves that are going to waste. And I wouldn't say that event was a magic bullet, but we certainly got the FCC's attention. They weren't real happy about that notion of end running them, but they did get a lot more serious about opening more of the airwaves, including the vacant TV channels, which we continue to try to finish that proceeding. Clay's insights here into collapsing the barriers to collective action should be particularly salient in Washington, D.C. Certainly this political cycle verifies the importance of this book for the political class. We look around and you see in the headlines, everybody's surprised. Clay, I'm sure, wasn't surprised, but many people were, that Obama is showing how Howard Dean's use of the Internet to organize and fundraise was merely a mild preview of democracy's future. And for think tanks and policy advocacy as well, I think Clay's insights and examples, are really have a lot of lessons and are a lens into our future. It certainly helped me to think about how New America and other policy shops now have an enormous opportunity to do things differently, to reach larger audiences, to collaborate on a more interactive basis. And so I think, whatever part of the DC ecosystem you're from, that you're going to find a lot in here that's going to make your job, your organization, potentially a lot more effective. So with that, let me turn it over to Clay, who can take as long as he'd like, and then Sasha Meinrath is going to give some comments in response. From his perspective, Sasha is the research director of the Wireless Future program here, and he joined us just last summer, but has a long history of social media activism and founding a community wireless grassroots network in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And so he's already been doing a lot of these things from a different perspective, which he'll offer. Clay?
Thank you very much, Mark. So as Michael said, I wrote this book. There it is, suitable for weddings, bar mitzvahs, copies for sale on the back. If you have an iPhone, you can buy it on Amazon right this very second. Why wait? And I've been writing, as Michael noted, I've been writing for a mainly technical audience for a dozen years or so. What made me want to write this book and write it as a book, not just 80,000 more words of blog posts, was wanting to reach a non-technical audience. I as I was seeing these effects spread, I realized it's not just the techies anymore, right? That they were the early ones to experience open source software, these kind of distributed collaborative tools and so forth, but this pattern is really spreading everywhere. And so I've tried to write a book for my mom. I mean, not my actual mom, who's an information scientist, but one's my mom, to explain essentially why this is a big deal and why this is a big deal outside of the world of geeks and programmers, why it's going everywhere in society. So the bullet point of the book, if I had to sum it up, is this, right? So there, now I've actually spared you having to buy a copy. This is the big deal, right? The internet does an enormous number of things in terms of lowering the cost of information, and a lot of them have been focused on in particularly around conversations about the media. But in many cases, those are amplifications of existing patterns, one-to-one communications, broadcast communications. The really radical change, in my view, is the fact that it's the first media that actually allows for group action natively, right? That groups have in the internet the first place where it creates a coordinating medium that everyone has access to. In the book, I walk through several patterns that I think are being enormously amplified by this change. Sharing, conversation, collaboration, and collective action. Sharing is the easiest pattern, right? It's the one that became obvious to everybody with Napster. It's also the pattern that requires the least amount of coordination between individuals, right? We have lots and lots of ways of sharing, but it doesn't necessarily require the people doing the sharing to actually even think of themselves as being members of a group. The social effects are kind of aggregate. Conversation is a little bit more complicated. It does require some degree of synchronization. That's the oldest of the patterns. We've had conversation on the internet since '74 with the beginning of mailing lists. Collaborative patterns are widespread in the programmer world. They're becoming more widespread elsewhere. Linux and Wikipedia are probably the two great technical and non-technical examples of that. What I really want to concentrate on today, and what I will primarily talk about at the last of those four patterns, is collective action, where a group actually comes together and applies its will not just to collaborating to produce a work product, but actually come together to create some change in the world. That is a basic human pattern. I think it is being amplified by the things we're seeing here. I'm going to tell three quick stories about collective action, and then draw some conclusions. So, story number one. Here's an airplane, stranded on the tarmac. Perhaps you've been there. This one landed in Detroit at the beginning of '99. It had been rerouted to Miami the day before, and then finally got to Detroit the following afternoon. And when they got there, they found, completely snowbound, they couldn't get a gate. They ran out of food, they ran out of water, the toilets began to smell, then clog, then break, then leak. Babies were crying, it was 20 below outside. One passenger nearly ran up the aisle and nearly popped the emergency door in their desperation to get out, and it was only the wind chill, right, that finally stopped them. It was the only arguments about the wind chill that finally stopped them. They landed at 2:45 that afternoon. They got off the plane at 9:30 that night. Right? In that 7.5-hour period, lawyers were walking up and down the aisle, canvassing people for the class action lawsuit that was going to result. They got dozens of names, and of course the press had a field day. And there was a general sense that the situation had grown intolerable, that passengers needed some sort of guaranteed rights, and that something had to be done. And then nothing happened, nothing at all. Northwest settled out of court rather than see any legal precedent set. And then they signed themselves up, along with all of the other airlines, for a toothless and voluntary customer service promise, right, which should have been redundant given the business they're nominally in, but was really all that they had to do, because it wasn't like the airline passengers could organize themselves to do anything about it. Here's another plane, actually several planes, stranded on a runway in the rain this time, not the snow. Perhaps you've been there. This was Christmas a year ago, and this was in Dallas at the tail end of December. Big thunderstorms moving through Texas caused the rerouting of a lot of these planes, and there they sat on the tarmac. They couldn't get a gate. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. The same thing happened to the toilets. Different babies, same crying. They were on that tarmac for 8 hours. Right? Press had a field day. There was a general sense that the situation was intolerable, that something needed to be done, and 8 months later, it was done, finished. Right? In August, New York State passed a law guaranteeing a passenger's Bill of Rights, and because New York State has the busiest airspace in the country, this is effectively national policy. What was different between 99 and 2007? Right? Why did one clearly disastrous mishandling of the responsibility to the passengers lead to nothing more than a few press articles and an out-of-court settlement, and another one led incredibly quickly to legislative action? Part of what happened was this. This is Kate Hanai. She was a Napa Valley real estate agent. She got off the plane. She was on flight 1348 in Dallas, and she was pissed. And you can understand why if you've been trapped in a smelly tube with your fellow man for an entire workday. Imagine if we weren't let out of this room until 9 o'clock this evening. But that's not the whole explanation, because people in Detroit were angry as well, right? They'd been treated as badly and they were as angry. But what Hanai was able to do was to use the media to her own advantage. She went home and she started Googling for every place that was writing about this air traffic delay. And then she would go in and find those articles and add her own comments at the bottom. I was on that flight, it was really terrible, this is what it was like, this is what it was like. Right? Sometimes her comments were longer than the article she was commenting on. Right? So far this sort of looks like internet kook. But then, the very last thing she would say in these comments is, if anybody else was on this flight, contact them. Right? And she started using the mainstream media as a coordinating platform for finding other aggrieved passengers. Once she'd done enough of that, she set this up, Coalition for an Airline Passengers Bill of Rights, and of course, a little button, sign our petition, you're one click away from gathering signatures. She gathers tens of thousands of signatures in the space of a few weeks, and suddenly the legislators are paying attention. Right? And so, in 8 months, with no budget and no staff to speak of, she gets a law changed that the legal system and the press weren't able to 8 years before. Note that none of this technology is at all fancy or new. Right? We had websites in 99, we had online petitions in 99. What we didn't have online was everybody. The big change here is that the entire traveling public now has access to the web and uses it, now reads about these things, and can immediately take action. So it was in fact the social change, the increased social density, rather than the novelty of the tools that changed this outcome. William James, the American philosopher, once said, "Thinking is for doing," by which he meant we don't have brains to give us abstract cogitation, we have brains to help us figure out what to do next. That is increasingly what is happening to media, or analogously what is happening to media. Publishing is for acting. Right? Every URL is a latent community. Every URL has, in addition to whatever the contents are, has a certain amount of attention applied to it. Now that's mainly not that useful, right? If we gathered everybody who was looking at the front page of Google today, those people wouldn't have much in common. But when everybody is looking at a page about an airline passenger's Bill of Rights, the ability to coordinate those people and give them some kind of leverage is a really big change. And what Hanai did was she created her own media, but she also used mainstream media, both as cause and as effect, to be part of the ecosystem. She directed other traffic from these stories through her own comment, and then whenever anybody wrote about her, because we're now in a post, because we're now in a post-Google age, or such a Google-permeated age, anytime anyone wrote about her or about the Coalition for Airline Passengers Bill of Rights, it was one search away from being able to sign up and join. And so the feedback loop created here could not have existed in '99, even though all the technology was in place. Second story. You remember flash mobs, the sort of the flagpole sitting of 2003? Right? Somebody would send out an email saying, let's all synchronize watches and show up at the same place at the same time. And then we'll all do something mildly surprising. So 100 people show up in Central Park and they sit on a stone ledge and they all make pigeon noises or whatever. Or this is a seemingly spontaneous pillow fight that erupts in the middle of Toronto. Well, flash mobs were promulgated by Bill from New York, who was signing the emails of the original flash mobs that went out. And that turned out to be Bill Wasik from Harper's Magazine. And he'd conceived of the whole thing as a critique of hipster culture. What he wanted to demonstrate is that hipsters are so brain dead that if you tell them that what they're doing is going to be mildly shocking to the bourgeoisie, they will do any damn fool thing you write down in a piece of email and completely set aside any personal sense of judgment. And indeed, He achieved this, and he achieved it over and over again. In fact, he achieved it so well that it spread spontaneously, right? First it goes to the West Coast. We have zombie walks in San Francisco. Then it goes to Toronto, it goes to France, it goes to the UK, and so forth. In 2006, it shows up in Belarus, right? This is now we know the cultural lag between New York City and downtown Minsk. And somebody puts up a LiveJournal webpage saying, hey, you guys, I know, let's have a flash mob, right? Let's all walk around October Square eating ice cream, which is, I guess, what passes for a good time there in Minsk. So here they are, the flower of Belarusian youth walking around October Square eating ice cream. In this photo stream, though, is a set of photos that don't usually show up in flash mob photos. The next photo after those is black-clad secret police dragging those kids bodily out of the square. The problem with the group eating the ice cream wasn't the ice cream. It was the group. It is illegal to act in concert in October Square. Lukashenko was an Eastern European dictator of the old school, and he stole the election in March of 2006. And then, in order to forestall Leipzig-style protests in the main square, he simply made this kind of activity illegal. So these kids adopted flash mobs as an end run around that, right? It wasn't like the government could penetrate the conspiracy. Right? There's no conspiracy. It's done on a weblog. How much more public could it be? And the government couldn't stop the group from getting into October Square because when they got into October Square, they weren't a group yet, which is the whole design purpose of a flash mob. So the kids created an environment in which the state had to react in real time. Right now, so this is a case of media leading to collective action. The proposal on the Buy Mob LiveJournal leads to this action. But it's not just that. The feedback loop is more complicated than that because the kids knew that they were going to provoke the state into real-time action. So they didn't just bring their ice cream, they brought their cameras. And they took these pictures and they uploaded them because at least part of their goal, in addition to getting the state to overreact, was to document that overreaction and show it to the West. Right? They wanted to create and distribute these photos because nothing says dictatorship like arresting people for eating ice cream. Right? So this is a brilliant propaganda move. And these guys have done several of these. My favorite is, let's all walk around October Square smiling at each other. Right? There's an ontological dilemma for the cops, right? Are you smiling because you're part of the conspiracy? Or are you smiling because you're happy? Because if it's the latter and I arrest you, next time you're walking around, maybe you're part of the conspiracy. And then the subtle asterisk, which is if you're walking around October Square smiling, you're probably imagining Lukashenko's overthrow. The original conception of flash mobs was to make fun of the participants. But these guys have adopted it as a real political challenge. One of the things we see over and over again when a new social coordinating tool is launched are people tripping over themselves to announce how stupid it is and how brain dead the users are. Anybody who remembers the launch of Twitter from about this time 2 years ago, right? Famously the most stupidest application ever if you read the trade presses on this sort of thing. Twitter being the service that takes SMS messages from your phone and rebroadcasts them to people who are watching your SMS messages and vice versa. It's a way of keeping track of a group. And indeed, if you go to the front page of Twitter.com, it's mostly banal, right? I'm listening to Green Day right now. I'm getting ready to do some Jell-O shots. I mean, I've pulled some remarkably unimportant things off the front page of Twitter. But Egyptian pro-democracy activists are using Twitter to coordinate their movements because it's really, really important for other people to know whether or not you're in police custody. If other people know that you're in custody, you may be in custody longer, but you're less likely to be tortured. So Twitter, in that context, is a really good deal. In high freedom environments like the US, when these tools are deployed, they tend to get deployed for entertainment, right? Let's have a flash mob to shock the other people in Central Park. In low freedom environments, anything that improves group coordination can take on a really political dimension, and I think that's what these kids have demonstrated. So. Third story, and this one is not in the book, in part because one of the frustrations of doing a book is the day after you turn in the final version of the manuscript, you see something and you think, oh, right, that could have gone in. And of course, particularly when you're looking at social tools and collective action, there are those stories every day. But this is one that's particularly interesting to me right now. In 2004, in Palermo, in southern Italy, an anonymous group, anonymous to this day, in fact, biked around the city, stickering the city with stickers that read, an entire people that pays the piso, that pays payment money to the mafia, is a people without dignity. Right? Number one story the next day. All the papers, all on television, all on television. A huge rhetorical slap at the mafia. What this group decided over time, though, is that rhetoric wasn't enough. Right? That taking a rhetorical swipe at the mafia was good, but it wasn't, that media alone couldn't solve the problem. They put up a website, audiopiso.it. And what they realized is that the web provides a way to coordinate otherwise diffuse actors who have some goal in common. So the first thing they did was they said to businesses, stand up together. Stand up together and refuse to pay the piso, refuse to pay the payment. Several times in the 90s, business people in Palermo stood up and said, I'm out. I'm dropping out of this system. Their businesses were invariably destroyed. Sometimes they were killed. When a whole group does it at the same time, the mafia can't pick them off one at a time anymore. And so they're a little bit stuck. In fact, since this campaign has started, there haven't been any obvious bits of revenge in Palermo. Then the audiopiso.it people realized, we're coordinating the businesses because they are diffuse actors, but they all have this common goal. But the real end state here is the customers, is the citizens. They're the ones suffering most. We could actually do something to coordinate the citizens. So they put up a search engine. Right? If you're in Palermo and you only want to patronize businesses that are standing up to the mafia and not paying protection money, they now let you do it anonymously. You can find these businesses. You can make a credit card donation. Right? They even show you how to fill out your Italian tax returns to make a non-profit donation to this organization. So they've taken a website which originally had some of the feel of the media campaign of just broadcasting this idea, an entire people that pays the piso is a people without dignity. And they've turned it into a coordinating tool with layers and layers of coordination. And what's perhaps most remarkable about this is that having done it, having shown how it's done, other southern Italian, other cities in southern Italy are copying this pattern, are doing exactly the same. Because the technology under the hood is not complicated, right? What really matters is that enough of the Italian population be online that this kind of coordination can have a good effect. Media is moving from a source of information to a site of action. A lot of mainstream media doesn't get this yet, right? You saw this a little bit with Oprah Winfrey and James Fry. When James Fry's memoir, Million Little Pieces, was turned out not to be a memoir written mainly from memory, but rather a memoir written mainly from making things up. And Oprah first went out in front of her public and said, you know, everything in the media is a little bit glossed up for public consumption. He just went further than most. Her audience did not want to hear that. Right? Her audience said, if that guy said he spent 30 days in jail, we would like to know that he spent 30 days in jail. In fact, he never spent a single night in jail. A similar thing is happening right now with Margaret B. Jones. This woman has written the not from memory memoir about South Central LA. Oprah was famously called out in public and had to go back on television and apologize, and then to show how sorry she was, she had to drag a bunch of other people onto her show and yell at them to get the audience back on her side. What she realized is that the web was a great new way for her to reach her audience, and it was a great new way for her audience to reach her. People were talking back to her. What she hadn't realized is that her audience was also talking to each other. And the reason the James Fry thing didn't just blow over is that when people saw how mad the other audience members were as well, it emboldened them. Exactly the same pattern as the Coalition for Passengers' Bill of Rights. I think a similar thing is threatening to happen. It will be interesting to see if it does. With the Democratic Party vis-a-vis the superdelegates. Right? There are very patient explanations that the process is meant to override popular will if the Democratic Party decides that's a good idea. And what's happening is a conversation seems to me to be starting to form in which people who are angry about that, whether it's according to the rules or not, are starting to talk not just back to the Democratic Party, but sideways to one another. If I had to pick any uprising to watch for in the current political cycle, that would be the one. Rank and file Democrats getting upset enough about the possibility of superdelegates overriding a popular vote that they coordinate in the same way. And this is what I mean about the side of action. Right? That once people are reading the same things, it creates a kind of shared awareness, but their ability to coordinate with one another is now much higher than it has been before. And what that leaves us with is a very different kind of society. One of the theses of the book is that the internet is not an improvement to modern society, it is a challenge to it. That in the same way that a society that has a printing press is a different kind of thing than a society that doesn't, a society that has these kinds of capabilities is going to be a different society. We are, in fact, it is in our historical generation that change is happening. And here effectively is that change, right? These freedoms guaranteed us were enumerated separately because they were presumed to be separate. But in the medium we now have, they're being fused. And documenting that change is what the book is about. I'm also, I've started writing about it at herecomeseverybody.org because we're just at the beginning of this, and these stories keep presenting themselves. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Clay. That's great, and hopefully we'll get a lot of discussion about some of the things you're raising, and perhaps some folks in the audience too have even their own examples.
Oh, I'm sure.
How this has happened. But first, we go to Sasha Meinrath from New America Foundation, who has quite a bit of experience using technologies for organizing, and give a bit of his own perspective before we open it up.
We're going to see if we can get the... All right, well, I'll just ad-lib for a little bit. That was an excellent talk, by the way. Thank you so much. And I think it's very important. A little-known fact is that before I came to New America, I came straight out of radical media activism. So I do a good job of passing, and I can dress up and wear a suit and go in and talk with folks. But my background is actually in doing and being a part of a movement called indie media. And I don't know, how many people here have actually ever heard of indie media? So indie media is interesting in that in 1999, we put into play a lot of these notions that Clay is talking about today, of collective action, of organizing using these new, at the time, very new tools, but from digital media production tools to information dissemination tools. And a lot of this came out of this notion of darknet and file sharing, etc. I have an example here. These are all live links right now, so you can go and play around with them if you want. This is called the Plexus. It's in Urbana-Champaign, which is a darknet. And I don't know, who's heard of darknets before? So most of the traffic on the internet is peer-to-peer. Darknets are systems by which people can file share that are de facto unhackable. So in this one, you can see you have to be trusted to get into it. If you remember strong encryption from wireless and et cetera, it's usually 128-bit encryption. It takes supercomputers, months and months and months and months and months to hack through something that's 256 kilobits. This thing is encrypted at 2,048 kilobits. It's almost unhackable. It's de facto unhackable. There's a lot of information behind it if you know who to even talk with to get access to it. And the notion was, in a society where file sharing of various types is prevented, the techies, the geeks of the world, were building alternative infrastructures to share information that are unhackable by the RIAAs and MPAAs and et cetera of the world. There's no way to know not only who's using this, but what's on it, even if you're a part of it. And growing out of that came this notion of the Independent Media Center, which is that we need a way that anyone can be part of the news production cycle. And this sort of culminated in the battle in Seattle in 1999, if you can remember back to then, where protesters appeared to materialize out of nowhere. It was sort of a gathering, a text mob before there were text mobs writ large. 50,000 people from across the United States organized on a totally different form or level than we've seen previously. It caught all of the security forces in Seattle by storm. I mean, they had no idea that it was this organized because there wasn't any centralized authority telling people where to go or what to do. This has grown now from the single independent media center in Seattle, and if you look down the, your left column here, it's grown now to, and starting right here, IMCs, to 150 of them all over the world. It is, in fact, today the largest all-volunteer media production group in the world. And it broadcasts in scores of different languages. It's all run, if you can believe this, through a consensus decision-making process. There's no central authority for any part of it, which is amazingly frustrating for the police, who try to shut this down. In fact, the structurelessness of the organization is its defense in what allows it in many ways to operate in areas of the world like Baghdad or in China or in Darfur that do not want this information to get out. And indie media has actually broken many of the stories that are picked up days later by the mainstream media in sort of the world's hotspots. In fact, if you look worldwide where the hotspots are, in fact, you'll often find indie media reporters on the ground doing primary documentation of things. What's radical about this is anyone can upload, anyone can comment. The public, and much like Wikipedia, becomes the fact checkers of the stories on indie media. So from there, I'm going to sort of bridge us into what, and this is sort of the transition, if you will, that I went through in doing indie media, doing radical media, doing media production, to dissemination, which will explain very quickly how I ended up here in front of you. Which is that we realized after a bit in 2000 that we were creating all this great media. And then we had these applications and services that we were offering to our community and no way to disseminate it. In fact, we found that our local television stations, the national television stations, if they were reporting on these sorts of issues, usually it was about those damn protesters and blah, 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 and black bloc and anarchists, not about all the global justice issues that people were actually there to talk about. So we needed to create our own infrastructure. That was our solution. And thus was born, in my case, the Urbana-Champaign Wireless Initiative, the QN Foundation, Champaign-Urbana Community Wireless Network, but also a whole host of other groups around the globe. And what was interesting about this is this notion, and this is in 2000, you have to imagine, of a community-wide, a metro-scale network that interconnected everyone who was already doing peer-to-peer applications and services and connectivity with a peer-to-peer infrastructure. We were talking about this in 2000. We were told at first that it was crazy, but then what ended up happening is all of these social and economic justice ideals that we held got usurped by what became known as the Municipal Wireless Networking Movement, the AT&Ts of the world that didn't want us to be building these things in the first place. The Earthlings of the world that were very worried about their business models got involved in this. And then we had several years of attempts to build these municipal wireless networks in the United States, culminating with these franchise models consistently failing in Philadelphia and San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. So that today, or in this case 2 days ago, you now have the commentary is ad hoc Wi-Fi, an alternative to Muni Wi-Fi, which is basically saying that what we knew years ago might actually be the solution to the problems that we created in the interim. What's interesting about this in particular is that the technologies, and this is what Clay also touches upon today, are such that we can do things that had never been thought of before. It's not just the media production, it's the information infrastructure that can be built differently than the broadcast model, which has captured us all the way back to the 1840s and 1850s with the telegraph. We now have this peer-to-peer model that's available and that the FCC and decision makers in the United States and worldwide have no clue about. So this is actually from a few years ago. I wrote up a brief thing basically saying that these technologies are radically shifting the nature of communications. This notion that we cannot communicate directly with one another, even though I'm pretty sure most of us have cell phones on us, We always get routed up through some sort of central authority, a tower, that charges me on the way up, you on the way down. Entirely inefficient. We should be able to communicate directly. Hacker friends of mine in Europe have finally just finished up a port to turn Android's phone, the Android phone, and the iPhone into meshing technologies that allow for that peer-to-peer communications. Exactly. Very cool. So all of a sudden now we can do all sorts of things locally, where we can build a geographically based ad hoc network to communicate directly. And this notion of moving not just to the first from indie media and media production, but actually to creating infrastructure that is peer-to-peer is what is happening like right now today. And so at New America Foundation, we're working on things like white space devices and trying to open up the spectrum to make room for these technologies we already know are coming, but have no space in the electromagnetic spectrum, which means that the FCC either can say, let's make space for this today, or they can do the, regulatory equivalent of attempting to stop jaywalking at a national level because everyone's downloading patches for these software-defined radios from servers in Taiwan and running them in East Podunk, Illinois. That's going to be the reality. It's the one that no one wants to talk about. But now we're talking about building infrastructure that is not just a couple of people meeting up together, but entire communities can build these infrastructures. So from application to creating an ownerless infrastructure, if you will. And with that, I think I'll open it up to discussion, debate. Hopefully your brains are like humming at this point in time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sasha. That's you can tell Sasha doing some fascinating work here and beyond. I don't know if Clay, if you have just initially any sort of reaction in terms of how some of this ties into.
Absolutely, there's a model that engineers have been using for decades now called the stack, which is essentially how does all of the hardware relate to all of the software relate to all of the uses. And what Sasha and I seem to have done sort of in pairs is talk about things high in the stack, which is up where the people are, and low in the stack, which is down where the hardware is. As long as things are stable, you don't have to think about multiple levels. You can just kind of take things for granted. Oh, well, all of this, the telephone works, and now I'm going to build a phone bank. But when hardware gets to be in play, when there's new capabilities low in the stack, then the social effects of that are actually quite profound. And that's, I think, a big part of what's happening is in a way, the new freedoms that we're seeing, what economists would call a positive supply-side shock to freedom, are really showing up at all layers of the stack. So you can start down where the hardware is, look at Muni Wi-Fi and ask, what are the social ramifications going to be? Or you can start with social ramifications and say, what has to be in place beneath that to support this model? There's no one right answer. I think it's interesting to have sort of conversations across that, across those sort of looking from the bottom up and the top down.
Mm-hmm. And I think this becomes... This becomes... Oh, okay.
That one might work too.
This still becomes very important when you look at how companies today, corporations today, are attempting to leverage control over one part of the stack, say infrastructure, into the application layers. And so in some ways this sort of, what some might construe of as civil disobedience, but it's vitally important to protecting those freedoms that Clay showed you right at the end, your First, Fourth, Fifth Amendment rights to freedom of association, freedom from surveillance, and freedom not to incriminate yourself, which has become obviously a major problem when things that you post on the internet are forever, and you need that anonymity in order to put things up. So it is very interesting that in this day and age, the battles that are being waged in D.C. are focused on how do we prevent that sort of capture of different layers of this stack by groups that had traditionally been separate entities.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that the connection between, things we work on, such as, or we're mindful certainly, we hope it's clear to others, that issues such as open spectrum and open networks, like network neutrality, very much have an impact on the ability of groups to organize without organizations to work around. And if those walls are breached in the United States, if that's weak in the United States, it's just going to be that much worse overseas, where the stakes are even higher. As Clay said, some technologies that get used primarily for entertainment here are essential to democracy fighting, in those countries.
There's a question here.
Yeah, let's go to questions, and please identify, who you are, who you're with, and.
I guess I'm the happiest person in this room because of the second example. I'm from Belarus. Radio Limited, we broadcast to Belarus.
Fantastic.
And you're quite right, Clay. We know about this act before, and we put our photographers there and reporting them, of course. My question is, when these effects which you're describing, when technology becomes a social event, how do we know when it becomes social? I had this enormous traffic to my website during the elections, like 300,000 unique visitors in a month. But then it went kind of down. Now I handle about 60,000.
Yeah.
And basically, whatever I do, I cannot raise it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one question. But when it becomes really social, maybe the time hasn't come yet. But the second question is, how does it affect in your view, this citizen journalism? How does it changes the role of traditional journalists? What is the new job description kind of?
Let me take on that second question first, because there's a really interesting example going on right now at a site called HuffingtonPost.com. They started a project called Off the Bus. The idea being that it would be political reporters who weren't on the bus that they would. And so the original model for this is the kind of classic model of citizen journalism, which is everybody can be David Ignatius. Right? And we're going to go out and create this sort of new platform. Well, it actually turns out that a pretty high percentage of people who can be David Ignatius already are David Ignatius. Right? In fact, it's not a real, like being a good political reporter as a single source, voice, researcher, writer, etc., doesn't turn out to be a widely shared skill. What Off the Bus has discovered is that their principal advantage is not having a handful of people who are as good as the professionals, but rather having hundreds of people who can do a little bit of work. So when the Iowa caucuses came along, right, typically a reporter is dispatched to a caucus and then has to extrapolate. Right? So of course the campaigns steer them to the most popular rallies, and then reporters who often think that they're looking at something in the middle of the bell curve think, well, gosh, if this is what a regular Obama rally looks like, imagine what the really popular ones look like. In fact, they've been steered to the really popular one. So it's an attempt to skew the reporter's vision. What Off the Bus was able to do was to send one person to every single caucus in Iowa for an hour. Right? And they could completely cover in a width versus depth trade-off that professionals can't accomplish. They're doing a similar thing right now, trying to interview every single superdelegate. They're not trying not to make arguments about representation anymore. So it seems to me that the tedious conversation of bloggers versus the mainstream media, what Off the Bus shows is that there is a way in which I think we can get past that and say essentially there's new forms of information gathering, and that Sasha talked about this, the tension between production and distribution can lead to some degree of hybridization. The problem with all of that, of course, is that the business model of traditional journalism does not do well with that. As a result, I think the sort of public radio, public funded model is in a better position not to suffer in the short term, but I think that degree of hybridization is coming in the long term. To the other question of how do you get your traffic up, if I knew that, this wouldn't have been the book I'd written. I'd have written something on search engine optimization and be running around talking to business conferences instead.
Yeah, I would just add to that the only reason why there's a battle going on is because traditional media journalism have done such a poor job of the depth part of their responsibilities that the breadth part of citizen journalism is often better in its coverage and more accurate often in its coverage. And that's just a a failure to do their job on the part of the mainstream media.
Kirsty Soto, I'm with a communications firm here in town. Enjoyed your talk.
Thanks very much.
I've been reading Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, which this is the next thing I'll be reading, which sounds very good. Your talk suggests to me that, the old quote, information is power. In this case, information is action. Looking forward to reading this. This is very interesting.
Great.
Now, there's a lot of equipment out there, too. You talked about equipment. I was at a wireless convention, and there are a lot more people out there. And the equipment is cheaper to buy cameras, to buy reed switches. Some cameras are a lot smaller than the ones you see in trafficplan.com. So what you said about the equipment being out there and needing to send applications.
Yeah, no, it's really quite a radical change.
Someone right here.
Yeah, Elliot.
You're supposed to say that you're Elliot.
Elliot Maxwell. I don't think that you're saying that these are sort of either-or choices in terms of whether this completely replaces existing media.
No. In fact, specifically not.
Right. So
If it turned out that in fact everybody could be David Ignatius if they were given a blog, that would be one thing. That's not been the case.
So one of the questions sort of flows from your first comment about the flash mobs, and that was this was the creation of someone who wanted to mock this particular phenomena of sort of hip culture. What's going to be, do you think, the interaction between those people who will want to use these tools for their own non-social justice related purposes? What happens when the Belarus police say, I want to be starting to organize these things and bring people in? Are the self-correcting mechanisms for these technologies able to deal with nuanced message, as opposed to, boy, I hate sitting on planes, or boy, I dislike dictatorships, when there are facts in dispute and different choices to be made? How will these mechanisms deal with more complicated actions, more complicated situations, and the possibility of subversion?
This is in my mind the question. I mean, every book you write is in a way of getting out of the book you ought to be writing, and you just described the book that I didn't know how to write yet. There's a problem with filtering that's really, really profound. We've moved from a filter then publish world where every radio and every TV station, every newspaper decides in advance what goes out that day, to a world where everybody can say everything and all the filtering has to happen after the fact. There's also a problem, as we've seen quite dramatically with Wikipedia recently, with governance issues, where the desire of people to game relatively open social systems forces on those open systems a degree of reclosure in order to protect the original virtues, which means undoing, you get into a constitutional crisis, right? There starts to be a tension between anybody can produce and we have to protect the good of the whole. I'm pessimistic about this in the short term. There's a very interesting case sort of circulating right now. The video of the Marine seemingly throwing a puppy off a cliff, and his family, his extended family, are now getting death threats. Of all the things to be worried about in the world, and possibly even all the things to be worried about just limited to the DoD's sphere of influence, as terrible as that event is on some 0 to 10 scale, it does not come close to being the most important thing to be thinking about. But because we have a world right now where particularity is what engages the emotions rather than depth of importance, we are going to have to find ways over the long haul to filter the banal from the important. If you go right now and you look on any news site and you look at the most viewed articles, you'll find things about the recession, you'll find things about Abu Ghraib. If you look at the most forwarded articles, you'll find things about puppies and kitties, right? So the most forward, the most emailed and the most viewed are different kinds of lists. And the choice about which of those lists you think reflects popular interest is really going to lead you down, I think, the thing you're working on, which is even if we say that what we've got reflects to some degree the interests of the people, which most email clearly does, choosing which of those metrics to adopt has huge ramifications.
Just to follow up on that, you use the term openness in terms of Wikipedia and the judgment processes that go into place. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to be most careful about in terms of thinking about these social movements is that we don't equate the most openness necessarily with the optimal choice. That the issues are going to be how to think through the appropriate degree of openness and filtering for the particular purpose, because you basically don't want a surgeon to be reading the comments of 4,000 patients, surgeons, and quacks about how to do the next amputation. You want to be able to say, this is what we know to the best of our understanding from the standpoint of the science. So that
They're
quite openness with virtue, but openness with a particular purpose and its optimization is the goal.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I said in the book is essentially this stuff is the experimental wing of political philosophy, and those kinds of trade-offs between democratic will and technocratic expertise. Most of those fights are still in the future, but they're coming everywhere. There's a couple in the back.
Yeah, way in the back, I guess.
Jeff Aaron, I've got a couple of questions / comments on people well short. Insurgent groups, terrorist groups. It's not the top-down government necessarily you have to worry about, but the organizational skills of folks that want to harm other people, neo-Nazis. That's one thing. The technology has been driven, some of the things that I've read, in large part by the distribution of pornography. That corporations, Microsoft, credit card companies, Real Player, revolutionize their hardware to push porno, and everybody else is able to utilize. Some comment. That's fine. The final, and I think we just covered this banal world of information, is Malaya Kundera talked about a couple decades ago about everybody writing a novel, right? And now you have everybody writing about everything. And it goes to the ability to sift through this. And are we still talking, a couple of points where people actually get together? Or do we all, you look at the Hillary post and the Obama post, everybody's just talking past each other. So I don't know how is there such thing as too much democracy? There's too many voices and everybody drowns each other's voices. So, and then the monetization of, I work for a think tank, America has a think tank. Everybody comes and takes a little piece of information from everybody. We're all sort of like the New York Times, but they're not leaving anything behind because they just expect everything to be free on the internet. And it's intellectual property. And maybe that's the last thing.
If they're not leaving anything behind, you may want to think about restructuring your relationship with them. There's no way to put the genie back in the bottle of unlimited perfect copies available ubiquitously to individuals and groups worldwide. Like that's just, we're living in the middle of the greatest expansion of expressive capability in the history of the human race. That's just that it fell to our generation to bear the brunt of that. That's what's happening. You may want to rethink the question of what value people are leaving in terms of ideas, organizations, ways in which they can support your organization, proselytize for it, whatever. I mean, that turns out to be a big part of this restructuring. I grimaced about the idea of pushing out pornography because the problem with pornography is actually that it is currently poll-driven. Right? You don't have to print any copies of anything in advance of people's interest in seeing it. The reason Reel and chip companies and bandwidth companies and router companies and have optimized around pornography is that pornography has turned out to be the largest source of untapped demand for multimedia content. It is a sad commentary on the human race, and in particular our half of it, that is true, but that is true. And so I don't think that we can rush to sign Cisco up as an eager pornographer so much as someone responding to market demand from companies that are, at least in the context of this society, legitimate. So I think that, in a way, this is a classic problem of a bunch of the locus of control of pornography after the Miller test, which is the 1973 case, rested with the idea of contemporary community standards. But the idea of contemporary community standards were entirely affected by the bottlenecks of media around that community. And all pornography litigation effectively stopped when someone being sued in Utah had the brilliant thought to subpoena the records of the movies being watched in the hotel across the street. And the minute those records came in, and it turned out everybody was watching, Hot Wet Subteens or whatever it was, the idea of contemporary community standards as a bulwark against interest in this stuff vanished. So the problem of living in a society with ubiquitous distribution of pornography is something that I think merits a significant conversation, but I don't think it can anymore be located at the media bottleneck. And in fact, that's a metaphor for all kinds of problems, as with the WikiLeaks case we just saw, as with the erosion of journalistic privilege as a notion. We just used to situate a bunch of stuff at that bottleneck that we can't do. And certainly the ability to stand up, these Belarusian kids to stand up and protest against the Lukashenko government is intimately tied to the ability of, as you say, neo-Nazi groups to do the same thing. Analogous to, in a political context, analogous to Publish Then Filter, we're moving to a world, we're essentially moving to a world where there's going to be less prevention and more reaction to these groups. And this is essentially this is the great dilemma. This has been the great dilemma on the ground in Iraq in the post-kinetic phase. We were on a reactive footing and didn't really have structure for dealing with that for a long time. What's happening now isn't so much that we're going back to prevention, so much as we're getting much better at reaction. And I think many sectors of society are going to live through that change.
Yeah, I was just going to add, we're living in an age where each time you try to stop these technologies or stop these things from happening, more people hear about them, more people use them. So when you crush, Napster, you end up with BitTorrent. You go from a technology that could have been regulated and done in partnership to one that is totally distributed and impossible to have that kind of partnership with. And when you try to shut down WikiLeaks, all you end up with is scores more mirrors of the exact same information. In fact, the judge just came out and said this had exactly the opposite effect of what I was trying to do when I said you have to shut down the website. And that's a reality that decision makers need to understand. Otherwise, they're going to keep, grabbing the water balloon and squeezing it very tight and being really kind of confused by the reaction that creates.
That's a nice image.
Yeah, Beck, in the middle there, yes.
Karen McAlpine, excellent talk.
Thanks very much.
I think in addition to being students of all of this, a lot of people in the room are sort of in the business of advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, do you have any sort of advice for people that are trying to develop online campaigns and things like that around specific issue areas, whether it be for clients or for 501c3? And then the other thing is, when you don't have a bunch of people sitting on a plane and a specific policy outcome you're driving to, how do you address the issue of relative influence or relative success or in a sort of a campaign?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the second question. What are the metrics when you don't have an immediate outcome?
Yeah, not everything has a specific outcome you're driving to.
Right. It's weird. In fact, this is one of the big open questions: is what's happening to protest culture? Because right now, the protests that are working seem to me to be hard to fake non-professional surprises, I guess I'd say. There's some real cost being borne by the people doing the protesting. They're not from long-lived groups. They're from real, like the airline industry would have spent millions of dollars to get Kate Hanna to back off. She didn't have an organization she needed to raise money for, and she didn't have demand number 2. So you couldn't get in any trade-off. She had a demand. That was it. Here's the Bill of Rights, yes or no. And in a way, one of the questions right now is: Are institutional models of social change, losing some purchase to movements again, as happened in the 60s, and then we deinstitutionalizing to some degree? And then asterisk, does that create some real risk that the loss of institutional counterbalancing actually lets some institutions operate under cover of darkness, right? My nightmare, back to this earlier question of journalism, is the 2008 is actually the year in which the advertising revenue in the newspaper business goes away. And the Times will be fine, the Post will be fine, right? They'll write articles complaining about it, but they're still going to have thousands of employees. Who's going to take it in the neck is the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, right? And do we go to a world where every city of less than 1 million just gets endemic civic corruption again because of the loss of investigative journalism? So that's I don't have an answer to that question, so I didn't put it in the book, because it's really like that's a sort of like, where do we go from here? Halo question. About how do you get these groups to do this? Obama has done a better job, I think, of stimulating and taking advantage of citizen media than any campaign in history. And what he seems to have done, differently than what Dean did, interestingly, is to create an environment in which citizens actually know that they're supporting the candidate without replacing their own beliefs with his. What happened to Dean is a lot of people said, well, if you're anti-war, right, you also must be a dope-smoking, Birkenstock-wearing radical vegetarian. No, in fact, right, the guy's a fiscal conservative. He had a good voting record from the NRA, and a bunch of people ascribed views to him he didn't have. Obama seems to have avoided that fate. And here's a model that I think is kind of interesting. You know the quiet car on the Excella? Right. So the quiet car, something happens that happens in almost no other walk of life, which is that citizens are willing to laterally enforce the rules on one another quite harshly. Right? You see a business guy get on to start gabbing on his phone, 3 people will turn around and go, tsk, right? And I've seen this happen several times, and these are people who are not used to being confronted by their fellow citizens. They get their backs up, and then they realize, oh, these guys can call for backup, right? That if I start fighting with my fellow passengers, the conductor comes, and if I'm fighting with the conductor, I look worse than I do now. And so every time I've seen this happen, the business people have to get off the phone or get up and move. What the quiet car model says is, if you make it clear what the goal is, and you make it clear that it's shared, and you're willing to provide backup, right? You guys can do this on your own, but if there's a problem, we're going to step in and help, right? The conductor actually has to do almost no policing of the quiet car. The guarantee of backup, it turns out, is one of the things that lets citizens do the enforcement on their own. And I think there is an organizing model that says essentially, we're here as the court of last resort. If you guys are organizing and trying to get something done and something goes wrong, we'll step in. But other than that, we're just going to show you how it's done, and you go, go, go. Off the bus, in fact, works on a very similar principle. I should shut up.
Right up here.
Dave Witzel. You've given a couple of examples that I guess I think a lot of the examples are reactions against the authority structure.
Right.
I'd be curious about your thoughts about kind of positive collaboration around governance and social decision making. I mean, basically, can we disintermediate government using this approach?
To some degree, you can. That is the further shores, right? That is the stuff that has largely not happened yet. Most of the examples we have of politics are reactionary. Most of the examples we have of collaborative production are technical, as with Linux and Wikipedia. It seems to me that we have a way of deferring to groups in this society and saying that group has essentially taken on this challenge and they've created this structure, and we're going to defer an enormous amount of social judgment to them. And that mechanism is called the corporation. Right, and there's a huge body of law that says essentially, once you say you're that, like, we're just going to hand over a whole bunch of deference to you. Beth, the best work I know of going on in that direction is Beth Novak and David Johnson at New York Law School have created in Vermont essentially a lightweight shell of a corporation. It looks like a corporation to the state from the outside. From the inside, it's essentially a group of people who signed up and agreed to be bound together to achieve some goal together. It is analogous in the way to to the way the GNU public license, which is the classic open source license, used copyright law to defeat the goals of copyright law. What the Vermont model does essentially says, we're going to give you this corporate protein code so the state and the legal system recognize you. But really, it's just a group of people signing up to be bound by an internal set of rules and to take on this deference. And that, it seems to me, is at least we'll know whether or not we can disintermediate from larger government once that's possible, because it seems to me that the group has to be able to come together and take on. I mean, the thing that's true of all of the protest groups is they'll disband if their goals are reached, right? And it seems to me that constructive groups need more structure than that, and we don't really have good ways in society to give them that structure, but there are these experiments going on that I think are maybe interesting. And Mark had a question.
Hey, Mark Schmidt here in America. Glad you were able to get
here. Yes, thanks very much.
I'm curious about kind of the model of what you can achieve both. You use an analogy of journalism that as we lose those mid-sized city papers, nobody will be doing that kind of investigative reporting that takes long-term, large-scale investment. I'm wondering on the side of social action, idea development, and so forth. It seems like we're running to a model where as institutions become less important than transactions. Something like what the woman did about the airplane is easy to do, as you say, because she doesn't have the burden of a large nonprofit to fund. She doesn't have a hugely complex proposal. How are we going to be able to do things that do require large complex proposals? I mean, is there a model for how you would build both the advocacy and the design of, say, healthcare policy in this new world, or does everything
start with a different thing? I mean,
small, atomized, one-shot things, and what are the consequences of being unable to take on big projects as well? Now, if you look at open source software, I mean, nothing's more complicated, right, than Linux. So there must be there must be an answer.
Well, Sasha just said Microsoft, which in fact is more complicated to its detriment. In fact, Linux is a great example. There's a pair of slides I show my students up at NYU that just like you can just see the light bulbs go off. It's the original proposal for Linux and the original proposal for Wikipedia, and they are both unbelievably modest. Linus comes on in '91. He posted this Comp OS Minix Usenet news group, which is Minix was a different flavor of operating system that he was trying to emulate. And he says, "I'm working on this little hobby. This isn't in fact going to be big and complicated, but here's what I'm doing. It's never going to be more than a hobby. In fact, I'm never going to port it to any other hardware than the hardware I happen to own, because that's all I can do." And he got half a dozen responses. But critically, they were from all over the world, and they were people who both cared and had some expertise, right? So it is. I think we are in an environment in which you will almost invariably be better off taking your $1 million idea and using it to fund $100,000 experiments. That the demand to know essentially what the new model looks like is actually blinding us to the possibility of just doing a lot of stuff. Because when the situation is this complex, things can fail for a lot of different reasons, and if you try one thing and it fails, you don't learn very much. Someone just asked me sort of what model should newspapers adopt to get through the next 20 years? Like, what's the business model? I don't think there is a 20-year business model. I mean, the most interesting reading I did for the book was the early history of the printing press, when it broke more institutions than it fixed. Even Yahoo, right, who basically invented the idea of the portal, who in fact invented the idea of the portal, didn't have a 20-year business model, as it turns out. So it's not premature to ask the question, but I think that any attempt to reason our way to the answer is going to underperform institutions engaging in lots of little experiments. Because I think the ones that grow, you can always tell a story about why Linux or Wikipedia was retroactively inevitable, but when you go back and you look at the original trust, they were just making shit up. They had no idea. And I think we would be kidding ourselves to think we know much more than they did then. I think that that for institutions, a high degree of low-cost experiments, a high number of low-cost experiments, is just going to be a better strategy than a small number of high-cost experiments.
You know, Clay, I'd like to ask you something else about Linux, and particularly, I guess, about Linux and Wikipedia would be prototypical examples of something, to ask about from a different perspective. A lot of the talk here has been about, using these technologies for, I think, to do things that have been around, forever, things like political organizing and things where maybe the self-interest of people is a little more clear. And something, not in your front talk, but in your book, which is excellent, is some discussion about the fact that some of these collaborations, such as open source software, Wikipedia, it seems to really undermine conventional economics.
Yeah.
We've been told that we're a society of individuals, not, we have no kind of collective motivation that's rational, and in an economic sense. And yet here are folks dedicating, making a lot of contributions without, where they could be free riders, where in fact there's probably an even larger number of people who are free riders, and yet they do it anyway. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more, because I thought that was a fascinating part of your book, say a little bit more about that. And also, in specifically, one thing you didn't mention in the book was, the concept of gift economies has been around for quite a while. Like Beck Carroll Rose at Yale, my former colleague here, David Bollier, in a report even for our program, wrote about things like, for example, this isn't an internet phenomenon only, right? There's community gardens in New York City are a form of gift community that goes on steroids with the internet. And I'm just wondering if there's anything that's different, specifically different now about these tools, or if this is just a way to really build out the gift economy in a big way.
Well, so I didn't use the phrase gift economy because sadly the literature on the gift economy is filled with good economic analysis and also a lot of trite, Age of Aquarius kind of stuff. And to sort out the difference between those two streams of thought was essentially more work than possible. What I think the internet has changed is the radius and half-life of love. We are used to a world where we have two very different productive spheres, right? We go home to our families and we make them dinner and we sit down and we talk and we clean up the dishes together and we wash the dishes and we read stories and whatever else we do for love, right? There's no transaction, right? I'm not looking up my wife's SIC code to say, oh, well, God, now you're a short order cook, so I ought to be paying you X, and whereas now I'm a dishwasher, so you ought to be paying me Y, and we'll see if we come out even at the end of the day, right? So in fact, we're completely familiar with being in a domain where none of our motivations are, not only are they non-economic, they cannot even be coherently backed into economic methods of accounting. We're also used to a world where if you want to get an encyclopedia, you got to pay people to write an encyclopedia. You want to get an operating system, you got to pay people to write an operating system. What's happened is not, I think, a challenge to neoclassical economics, which essentially always wrote off the domestic sphere. What's happened is that the radius and half-life of love, the degree to which my affection for doing something, the number of people that can affect, and the longevity of that effect has increased so radically. And the ability to produce shared product that continues to persist and create value, like Wikipedia, like Linux, it has essentially caused those two spheres to overlap. So the challenge to neoclassical economics is that the thing they essentially drew a circle around and said, oh yes, well obviously there is some sort of communal affection in families, and we're just gonna call that a special case and put it in this box over here. What happened is it got out of the box, and that's, I think, the real challenge here. Is we've always had social motivations, but because groups were defeated from doing large-scale things without economic motivations, the economists could get away with saying different special case. It's a much less special case than it used to be, and that's where I think the tools are essentially amplifiers of the human condition rather than alterers of it.
But they were also reducers of the cost of exercise.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
right.
Maybe the principal
Right.
thing.
Right.
That it's now easy to do something that you might want to benefit other folks, and very low cost.
Yeah.
And its effect is magnified.
Right. Precisely because of the lower transaction costs for getting together.
Yeah, the ratios have really
Right.
changed
Exactly, yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
Well, we should wrap up very shortly, but if there's any, particularly from our speakers here, any final
If you buy
words
only
of
one
wisdom?
book about lowered social transaction costs all week, make it this one. I think in a way the most interesting thing to me in doing the book was realizing how much society wants to believe that we are the way we are because we've chosen to be this way, and how much what's actually true is that there is a set of historical accidents that we have built on, and when those accidents get undone in one way or another, change is forced on society, and the illusion of our choosing to be this way gets pulled away. And that's, I think, the historical moment we're living in, and it's a really interesting one. So thank you for having me here to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. If you're not on our email list for notices about events like this, please be sure sign up or give me your card or anything that works.
That essay is so